Welcome, everyone, to Beyond the Bar. We have a very special guest here today, a guest who has degrees as a lawyer and degrees as a social worker, and as a result has a very unique career. Shelina Neallani, welcome to the show.
Thanks, John.
Shelina, you've written and spoken profusely on women in law, women of color in law, race, gender, violence against women, access to justice, and well-being practices. First of all, that's a mouthful of things that you've worked on profusely. And you've consulted on dispute resolution projects. You've taught at UBC, and you're an accredited mediator and arbitrator. And now LAP, Lawyers Assistance Program, is very lucky to have you on their staff. It's quite the legal journey. How did it all start?
Wow. Well, first of all, thanks very much for having me. I think, well, first of all, my interest in law. I think what really influenced me to go in law was, part of my family history, and that was related to, and I think I may have talked to you about this very briefly when we were just chatting about this. But my parents left Uganda. So my family, my maternal grandparents were born in Uganda, and a lot of my family had lived there for many generations. And post-colonial Africa was very unstable. And so my parents had the foresight to leave, and my sister and I and my mom and dad came to Canada. But the rest of my family, including family members that had lived there for 3 generations, a few years after we left, they all got expelled. And so I think that and that I think had a real impact on me, like the fact that people who had lived in a country for 3 generations could be expelled because of their race. And I think that sort of fueled my desire to go into law.
Interesting, because next question I was going to ask you was, what inspired you to do this? But that answers the question in a rather unusual way. But that was the inspiration.
Yeah, that was the inspiration. And, and I think that really impacted me, like hearing the stories of people having to leave. And I don't know if you know the history, but basically the Asians were expelled from Uganda and they had 90 days to leave. And so that was pretty terrifying for a lot of my family members. We were here already. And I think as a child that, and so that sort of rule of law, that interest in democracy, that, those things were really, fueled by that. And then after that, I really just wanted to help people. Like I really cared about people. I wanted to make the world a better place.
So that was the inspiration for the social work degree?
The social work degree, right.
Mm-hmm. So you received your social work degree before your law degree, is that right?
That's right, yeah. Okay.
Why the two?
I think the social work degree, it gave, partly because, I really did want to help people. You had and the skills I learned in social work are skills that I knew that were going to be able to help me. Just in the one-to-one interactions with clients, but broader than that, when I went into social work, I really wanted to help people, and I realized that you can help a lot of people by changing laws. And one of my major papers in social work was actually doing research on what was called then wife abuse, and which has continued to evolve over the years. And I realized that changing the laws around that time made a huge difference in the lives of people. And I don't know if you remember that, sort of way back when, sort of the changing policies around this area of law. And so changing laws could help, so many people. And so that I was really inspired. So the combination of the two was really sort of, and my career has sort of been on the intersection of those two things.
Well, one thing about your career, it's clearly been adventurous. And the other thing about your career, and one of the reasons why I wanted to have you as a guest, is because when we spoke, it seemed to me like you enjoyed the practice of law. And I know that we all of us have good days, bad days, and very bad days. But can you give the viewers some secrets about enjoying what they do? I rarely hear lawyers, apart from happy hour, saying that they have fun practicing law. But it seems to me that you've quite enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a really good question too, because, when you practice law, there's such a range of how you can practice law. You can practice law traditionally, which I did when I was starting out. I was a litigator. I loved going to court. I loved the drama of court. I didn't necessarily like the prep before court. So I enjoyed that part. And then, when I found that, and then I shifted, and as my needs and my interests changed, I shifted into more of a mediation practice, and I really enjoyed that. And so you can practice law in different ways, and I think it's just finding out what it is that brings you joy in it. And of course, helping the clients was really one of my favorite parts, like meeting one-to-one with clients and being able to help them, brought me a lot of satisfaction.
Okay.
Yeah.
On a number of times during the show, and I think you've watched a number of the previous shows, I've raised the issue of mental health of lawyers. And what has struck me is the prevalence of mental health issues for young lawyers. The Lawyers Assistance Program recently cited a study out of the University of Sherbrooke, finding that there is significant stress for lawyers in their first 10 years. And that's as a result of a career trajectory, family, starting a family, and financial pressures. What would you say to young lawyers in this province who suffered those kind of concerns that were raised in the Sherbrooke study?
I would first of all say they're not alone. I think many of us, including, me, Jeff, like that was a challenging time. You're early in your career, you're trying to prove yourself, you're trying to, learn, how to do things in court and in other kinds of practices, like you're really learning. At the same time, you're probably, you're often looking to settle down, maybe start a family, and you don't have a lot of resources at that time, particularly, and you talk about British Columbia, but if you live in Vancouver, with the housing prices the way they are, like there's a lot of pressure, and you may not have the same resources to get the help you need, with children or and so I think there's a lot of pressure on young lawyers. So I think the first thing is to know you're not alone. And the other thing is to build resiliency practices and to figure out what might work for you in those, and to get support to help.
Can you tell us what is involved with resiliency practices?
Yeah. So I think part of it is, recognizing when you're stressed, recognizing that you're in a challenging situation, that you're trying to do all of these things, and there's a lot of pressure, and being kind to yourself. I think that's the first part, is just really, being compassionate and empathetic to yourself, and knowing that you're trying to do the best you can given all the things that you have to do. And then finding ways, and everyone is a little bit different in terms of how they cope with stress or how they cope with things, but, exercise is something that I'm sure, many lawyers do, and I'm sure you do as well. Even if it's just a walk in the park, in nature, mindfulness practices, connecting with friends, finding somebody to process things with,
Martini.
Okay, so that is not a good coping.
I'm sorry.
I don't, and that's actually, and that's a good point, because during the pandemic there was a lot of people turning to, and so I think that can be a sort of a dangerous, place to go in terms of coping. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, those are the kinds of things that I think many lawyers practice. And I think what's important is to maybe, sometimes you have a toolbox of things that you might do. Like you might be a runner, or you might be, but it's learning other things as well that you can bring into your toolbox that might make you feel better.
And where do you find out about all this?
Well, one way is to attend some of the lab webinars, and there's lots of stuff. We have stuff online, and the other one is to talk. Like some of your other speakers have talked about connecting with friends. Share things with other people. Have an open conversation about how are you dealing with things. I think that's all helpful.
So, what is the most prevalent mental health issue here for lawyers? I don't know if I can answer what the most prevalent one is, but I know there's a lot of stressed out and anxious lawyers, at all stages of their careers. And a lot of it is the pressures of the profession. But it can be, and so I think stress and anxiety is a really
is a really big one. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You recently led a webinar on parenting, lawyering, and well-being.
Yes.
And how did you navigate a highly successful career, raise your daughters, and I know did a lot of volunteer work? Now, I don't want to cause any dissension between you and your husband, who is also a preeminent lawyer, but he intimates in one of his blogs that he's the one that likes trying new recipes. So does that mean that he did all the cooking?
Yeah, he's a much better cook than I am.
Okay.
I admit that completely.
Right.
He's a much better cook than I am, and he enjoys
Right.
cooking, and he finds it relaxing.
Right.
So that's true.
Let's
very
leave the
true.
cooking aside. How did you navigate all that, Shelina? That's a lot on your plate.
Yeah. So, and I'm really glad you asked that because, so Najib and I, my husband, we're both litigators. And so when he was on, when he had a trial, I was on for the kids. And when I had a trial, he was on for the kids. And it was crazy. Like, I literally was that lawyer that would show up in court with spittle on my jacket and soothers in my pocket, not having slept the night before. And it was a crazy time. And as the kids got older, like we tried different things like nannies, daycare, after school care, getting family to help us. We were those parents that showed up, the last parents to show up at daycare and, taking our kids to eat, pizza and driving them to their music lessons and their, soccer practices. And it was really crazy. And so I started looking at alternatives in terms of work, and so this will really interest you. Like, I wanted to go part-time and I was not allowed to go part-time where I was working. So that, doctors could work part-time, but at that time, lawyers couldn't work part-time. And that has totally changed now, and with COVID, I think that is totally, the work arrangements have completely changed. So I, when you work 4 days a week, you're often working 5 days and getting paid 80% of the time, with the 40 week. I tried 3 days. And then I came up with this plan, which I'm going to call the Laura plan. And this is, one of my colleagues who's also an excellent lawyer at Department of Justice came up with this plan because, we were all complaining about how are we doing this and getting support from all of our friends. And it was 3 days over 4. So you were leaving work at 2:30, not taking lunch, working right through, and then racing, and this is when the kids were a little bit older, picking up my daughters after school, kind of taking them to activities, checking in to see what they were doing, and then you could still return all your calls and emails at the end of the day, like you haven't sort of missed a beat, you're still, and then doing sort of the dinner piece, and then doing work again in the evening. So that was kind of like the cycle, and it was crazy.
So what is that, when you look back, think about it, what does that look like to you? What does that feel like to you?
It was a beautiful time. I mean, in a lot of ways, very intense. And I often say this: the days are long, but the years fly by. Like it was a very busy time, very full. And now I'm looking back because my daughters are grown, and I'm thinking, wow, like that really went fast. And I also shifted. Like one of your guests, Jeff, said earlier, like you have to shift what you need, and you have to adjust your legal practice as your life changes. And that's what I did too. Like I shifted, to mediation because we really didn't have capacity. And I was starting to, I had always settled things, as I'm sure you did as well. I was really a big believer in getting consents, and I always had that sort of DR lens. And so then, I decided to really take to really build a mediation practice and leave litigation, and sort of did more of an alternative practice after that.
So you mentioned DR, dispute resolution, and you have been on the forefront of innovations in that area. So can you tell the viewers some of those innovations?
Sure, I would love to.
And I'd also like to know which ones are ones that are used practically during a lot of mediations.
Yeah. So some of the innovations, partly because, there was a shift, particularly in family law, where there was more emphasis on doing dispute resolution before going to court. And I think many of us were doing that anyway, but there was more of an acknowledgement of that. And so, for example, in the family law area, I think that some of the things I worked on were projects that would help encourage people to try online dispute resolution, sort of do online pathways, instead of going to a website and getting a bunch of information about family law, being taken through a guided pathway which has, next steps for them, which has resources for them. And then if they need help, getting in touch with a mediator and allowing them to connect with a mediator to try to resolve things out of court. So that's one example. In the workplace, because I did a lot of, I do a lot of workplace mediation as well, that the idea there was to try to encourage people to have informal conversations in mediation without having a formal process like an investigation or filing a formal complaint, to allow people in the workplace to have those informal meetings to see if they could resolve their disputes without elevating it. So that's another example, and just bringing that lens.
What does an informal meeting look like during mediation, or is it before mediation?
I'm calling mediation an informal meeting, but it's actually a formalized meeting. But sometimes we do conflict coaching as well, where you're coaching people to have their own informal conversation with somebody to try to resolve a dispute. But you're right, mediation is more formal, but it's not as formal as an investigation complaint, which has a set process. In mediation, you have more flexibility in terms of how you're going to do it and what the process is. So those are some of the examples. Bringing that lens to some of those projects, and they were great projects. To work on, to try to shift cultures in certain institutions by introducing them to dispute resolution and making them aware of the benefits of it, and as well as trying these projects.
How do you gauge whether these ideas come to fruition or not in the actual mediation?
So you mean like whether I'm talking to somebody and saying,
how often it's being used and how often it's successful? How do you know that?
I think like for some of the online dispute resolution stuff, a lot of it's still sort of in the pilot phase where you're trying to work with technology and trying to give people the opportunity to have resources to help them resolve their disputes. I don't know if that's better than having a real person, do something, but it's giving people something and helping them move forward. So, I think just like in mediation, you don't necessarily view a successful mediation as a complete agreement on everything, but you've moved people forward. Maybe they have a better understanding of what the other person is experiencing so that they can be ready to move forward. So, in terms of gauging success, I sort of feel like even if you're educating people about giving them information about what the law is in a certain area, or listening to their story and letting them talk to you about it and maybe giving them a different perspective or helping them move forward, I think you're moving them along. And so I think in that way, I would say all of these initiatives that allow people to do that moves them forward.
Any movement forward in family law is positive.
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
You mentioned, Shelina, that COVID brought mental health issues, or some of them, to the forefront.
Yes.
And why is that? Do you recall?
I think there was a lot happening at the time that COVID hit. And, you have to sort of think back to 2020, which feels like so long ago now. But there was I think that people were anxious, and it triggered a lot of people who were maybe already feeling anxious and maybe already feeling stressed. And so having to be at home and be isolated, I think brought a lot of that to the forefront. And then in addition to that, you had a lot of disruption. Like you had Black Lives Matter, you had climate change issues. You remember the heat dome that we had the summer when COVID started. You had, world events that were happening. And I think, all of these things were adding to people's stress, I think. And then in the legal profession, it was really insane. Like, the courts were open, the courts were closed. People didn't really know whether to settle things because they didn't know what the markets were doing. Like, there was a lot of anxiety. They didn't know whether to follow parenting plans and orders because, one of the spouses was working in the hospital and they didn't, there was just, it was crazy. I don't know if and so I think in that sense, everything was heightened. And I think being on Zoom was also exhausting. People had to learn that technology. And so I think that contributed to people feeling very, very stressed out.
So what did you tell, if you told lawyers anything about this, about loneliness and isolation during COVID? If somebody approached you and said they were feeling that way, what would you tell them?
Well, first of all, that they're not alone. I think many people are feeling that. And, one of the things about it, though, is that people were able to connect through Zoom. Like, I think people were able to use their technology to connect with other people. And so that was part of it, is trying to find those bubbles and trying to find ways to connect with other people. I think that was a real challenge for many people during that period of time.
And that, in my view, is likely going to continue because I think as a result of COVID, there will be an increase in sole practitioners who will suffer from anxiety and loneliness and isolation. So what would you tell those people that are likely going to be practicing on their own?
To find legal community. Definitely find people who are like-minded, make the effort to try to develop those relationships, that they're not alone, that there are people around them. And I think it's challenging. I think it is challenging to make the time for that because of the pressures of billables and the pressures but to make sure that they're doing that as part of their self-care. And not just lawyers, but other connections as well.
So it's all about connection.
I think partly, yeah, I think so. And we talked about this a little bit early, like the self-care practices. Taking care of yourself, being aware of what you're feeling. If you're feeling isolated, how you can address that. And there's been a real shift in, I think, the legal profession as a result of COVID too. I think, people have recognized that people are struggling with mental health challenges, and there's much more openness to talk about it. So I think people can talk about it, and they can talk to their peers about it, and not face as much stigma as they have in the past.
Why do you think mental health has become such a prevalent issue? Is it because we're talking about it more?
I think that's part of it.
Yeah.
I think there's and also our leaders, Jeff, have, like the president of the Law Society came out very openly about her own mental health. The former president of the Law Society, came out very openly about her mental health challenges. Mm-hmm. And for a leader to be open and vulnerable and have that courage, I think, allows our institutions to change. Mm-hmm. And so I think that will allow then associates and other lawyers to sort of say, hey, I'm feeling stressed out, I'm feeling isolated, we're hearing about it everywhere, and so it becomes okay to acknowledge that you need that help, you need some connection. So I'm hoping those sole practitioners that you were referring to earlier, have practice groups and have supports, because they'll really need that.
If after this show a managing partner of a large law firm approached you and said, Shelina, what can I do for the young lawyers at our firm so they enjoy what they're doing? What would you say?
I think part of it is to really listen to what they need. There's a whole piece about the pressures of billable hours and whether that is, I don't know if we can change our model, but, maybe that's a bigger picture thing. But I think it's really talking to them about, what's important to them, mentoring them, giving them opportunities to learn and grow, providing that support for them. I think those kinds of things are really important for young associates. One of the things that I've heard is that, the firms will talk the talk to say they have, that their billable targets are not that high, that they want associates to enjoy other aspects of their life, but in fact, they're not. So I feel like they need to demonstrate that that's the case, and they need to also show by example that they are doing that, and so the associates can do that as well. Like, I think there's tremendous pressure, and part of it is driven by demand. Like, if there's so much work, then how does that all get done? So I don't know the answer to that, but I think that they can. The senior members of the firm need to address that, because I think it's going to be hard to retain associates because they don't want to live like that.
About 30 years ago, 1992, you authored a piece called Women of Color in the Legal Profession, Facing Barriers of Race and Sex. And I'm just amazed this was 30 years ago. And that work is cited often in other works, I've noticed. Obviously, there's been some change in 30 years, but has there been enough?
No.
Okay.
And there has been change, you're right. And by the way, I would never have named that paper what I named it. That was like the worst title ever. There's nothing catchy about that title. It was very earnest. But yeah.
So what else needs to be done to ensure equity and diversity in the legal workplace?
So I think the changes that are being made is people are recognizing that there aren't enough racialized lawyers and even women lawyers staying. Like, they're definitely being hired, but I don't think the culture is changed enough to support them and to mentor them so that they stay. And I think that gets back to the senior partners really taking an interest in the associates to find out what is it about the culture that is not making people feel included, or and I think that is firm by firm looking at what's happening. And I think that's the same issue with women lawyers as well. Like, I think that a lot of, there's a retention issue for women and there's a retention issue for racialized lawyers for a lot of the bigger law firms.
Okay. You've talked about legislation attempting to remedy problems. So
Yes.
In the last 30 years, has there been any legislation, or the most important legislation, to remedy some of the issues that you raised in your 1992 paper?
I think so. I think that I would like to believe so. I mean, I can't, I think there has been progressive legislation, but then you also see backsliding of some things in other countries, for example, where you're wondering what's happening. So I think it's a very strange time that we're living in, where I think a lot of the things that we took for granted in terms of legislative changes, some of those seem to be unraveling in other places. And so, I wonder about that.
Does it worry you?
It worries me, yeah. And it gets back to that rule of law thing, and respecting our legislative process and the whole parliamentary system and some of the divisiveness that you see. And so I think that gets back to sort of those early passions that I had about rule of law and, the role of the judiciary. And, and when you see those things happening in other countries, it really does worry me.
Okay.
Yeah.
In 2016, so we're only going back a few years, not 30. And that was 3 years after the Family Law Act, the new Family Law Act, came into force. You moderated a Mediate BC panel. And it's now 10 years after the FLA's enactment. And at that time, in 2016, the panel hoped that three things. One, presumptions regarding parenting would be removed. Two, voices of the children would be brought to the table. And three, and I didn't really understand this, there would be a fundamental culture shift and practical changes at the mediation table. So maybe before I ask you whether or not all those three things have sufficiently transpired in the last 10 years, you can tell me what the third one means: fundamental culture shift and practical changes at the mediation table.
So first of all, I'm not practicing family law anymore, so I can't speak sort of to date in terms of what's happening in the courts because I don't go to court anymore. But the idea there was that the family law legislation was shifting so that people were moving towards dispute resolution. And so, and I think it has happened, Jeff, that people do think about how to resolve things before they go to court. And I think that they, there was a time when everybody kept thinking mediation was meditation, like they would people didn't know what mediation was, and they were mixing it up, and it wasn't really it didn't come to mind right away when people were thinking about disputes. But I think that has shifted. Like, I think people first try to resolve things without going to court. And I think that was what the Family Law Act was trying to enshrine. And I think that's happened in all areas. I think there really is that push to try to get, to avoid court and to try to work things out.
Do you recall the reason why you wanted children's voices to be heard more?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Because, it comes down to sort of this phrase, no decision about us without us. Like, children have voices. They have, there's been a lot of research looking at the impact of separation and divorce on children. And so for them to be part of that process and be heard is really important from that sort of psychological aspect. And I think courts and other people were recognizing that and understanding that children, need the opportunity to be heard in these processes, not decide, but to be heard, to know that what they think matters and that parents are taking that into account.
I participated in many, many, many mediations. I can't recall one where the children's voices were heard.
So if they
and
get
how
heard,
are they heard in a mediation?
Right. So they're heard in different ways.
Yeah.
So, sometimes, like in some of my projects that I work, the mediator, in some of the kinds of mediations that I've done, like child protection mediation and mediation where there's adult children and you're looking at whether they should be entitled to support or not, those mediations, often, the mediator, with permission of the parents, would be able to talk to the child and bring their voice to the table. So that's an important part. There's also, Hear the Child Society and other organizations which will bring the children's voices to the table, with a third party actually interviewing the children, and they have a process to bring that voice to the table. So I'm surprised that the children's voices were, and it could be that the parents were on the same page about the voice.
No, I can assure you they're
okay.
not on the same page. What I was referring to, I can't recall ever seeing a mediator interview the children during a mediation, whether the mediation was a day or a week. I can't recall that ever happening.
Yeah, and I think that it's unlikely, and at least in my experience, that a child would attend a mediation unless they were an adult child, or unless they very strongly wanted to attend the mediation. Perhaps it was a child protection mediation where the ministry is also involved. And I think that that's to protect the child. They may attend for part of the mediation, or they may attend, I've had children, express their views by phone, like in an in-person mediation, where they would, talk just partly so the parents could hear what the child has to say. But again, you're always keeping in mind how that process might impact them.
Right.
Yeah.
I see there's a question. I'm glad people are asking questions. I'll get to them at the end. Shelina, there's one question that I was really looking forward to asking you. Don't worry about it. You'll be okay. You'll be okay. The ADR website says that you have a passion for peacemaking, connection, and kindness. How on earth do you apply that in an acrimonious family law dispute where the spouses are angry, resentful, and mean? Give us some secrets how to be peaceful, connect, and kind in that situation.
I think that's just what I bring in terms of who I am, really. I really, and that's just the energy that I bring to, and I respect where they're at. I really want to, it's with compassion. Like, they're angry and they're mean because of a reason. They're hurt, they're afraid, it's all of those things that are underlying that strong emotion, and it's sort of trying to unpack it. That's why I always do pre-mediation meetings with clients when I was doing more mediations, because it's to help understand their perspective, help sort of diffuse some of that and to move them forward. So,
any secrets about how to do that? Because we all encounter that, whether it's family law mediation or estate mediations or breakup of business partnerships. It's all the same feelings and emotions.
Yeah.
And any secrets about dealing with that?
It really is listening to what people have to say and having that compassion, and then trying to move them forward a little bit, in terms of, if people feel understood, sometimes some of that can dissipate. But, for example, in family mediation, like sometimes it depends where they're at. Like they're grieving the loss of the relationship. They could be in a number of phases, with how they're dealing with that emotionally. So sometimes it's not always possible. And the other thing that really surprised me, Jeff, is that when I did workplace mediations, it's how emotional those can be as well. This is people's livelihood, their sense of security, their integrity, and sometimes those some of those workplaces are sometimes like dysfunctional families. And so you're dealing with a lot of emotion in those workplace mediations as well. So you're quite right. It's in any kind of it's anywhere where there's emotion and there's conflict. You really need to understand where they're coming from and try to move them forward. Yeah.
So make the person feel like they're being heard and understood?
Yes. Yeah.
While they're getting angry with you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask, there's a question on the screen, and I'm going to ask you it now. Shelina, in your present role, do you get to feed generalized mental health concerns that you repeatedly observe into the other arms of the Law Society? I'm thinking in particular of the benchers' mental health. And I'm not sure what that question means. Do you have an understanding of it?
So, our executive director,
Yes.
Derek Lacroix, is very involved in trying to shift the legal community into appreciating the mental health concerns that lawyers bring to the Lawyers Assistance Program. And so I think it's trying to shift the way the legal community perceives mental health challenges so that they're more open and can discuss it. But the other part of that, and I'm not sure if this is what the person is getting at, but even in disciplinary hearings now, there's a movement to recognize that there may be mental health and addiction challenges and not go straight to a disciplinary process and try to have, and so I think there's some movement in the Law Society to recognize that it may not, maybe that person needs help instead of discipline. And maybe there's ways that we can support that lawyer. And so I think there's a shifting even in the Law Society. So that may be what that question is trying to address. I'm not sure entirely.
And part of that was our president coming out and telling the profession what her mental health concerns were.
Yes. Yeah.
So usually in the last 10 minutes, Shelina, I asked some rapid fire questions. Apparently someone has given you the liberty to ask me questions for the last 10 minutes, rather than me ask you what kind of ice cream you like or your favorite movie. So I think I'll give you that opportunity now.
Okay.
Before we end, I want to say just that we look forward to any more questions that anybody in the audience has, and we have time to answer them today. So I'm all yours.
Okay, perfect.
Now I'm feeling very vulnerable. Particularly because I'm interviewing somebody who has a law degree and a social work degree. So I have this feeling I'm going to get questions about feelings. And I don't know about that, but you go ahead.
So one of the reasons I really wanted and I wanted to have more of a conversation with you, Jeff, because one of the reasons you did this Beyond the Bar was because of your own experience. And I think you said that in your video introduction to this, that you weren't always happy and content as a family lawyer. And I would never have known that. Like I saw Jeff Rose, QC, now KC, doing all this incredible work in family law, and I would never have known that. And so you wanted to do this so that you could, give people the options, to tell people what the different options are, that it's not necessarily this track. And so I just wanted to hear more about that. And I wanted you to talk about what your experience was with that.
Yeah, as I said at the beginning, there's good days, there's bad days, and there's very bad days. And I think having practiced family law, I probably personalized what I was doing too much, and I wasn't objective enough. And oftentimes I prayed for more objectivity, and I hoped that I wouldn't take things personally. I hope that if I thought I made an error, that it wasn't the biggest thing on earth that happened. So I tended to dramatize any issues that confronted me, and probably worry about them much too much. Sleepless nights, all that kind of thing. I think I look at it now as I suffered from, but that's just my personality, I think.
Yeah. So did you ever reach out to like LAP or, to sort of say, hey, I'm struggling with this, or, if you were really having an existential crisis, like maybe I want to do something else, like what could I do? Or did you ever do that?
No. I would never have wanted anybody in the profession, including our dear friend Derek Lacroix, who runs the program, to think I had any sort of weakness. And I can say this, but maybe I'm just covering up the answer to the question. I mean, I always had a great network of friends that I could discuss things with. And I had friends that I could discuss some of the issues I was confronting with.
Yeah.
But no, I wouldn't have reached out.
Yeah.
Never would I have done that.
Yeah.
No.
And so you kind of talked to your friends about it, you kind of tried to work through it, and then, if you don't mind sharing, did you have some kind of resiliency, like other than connecting with your friends, did you?
Well, I read about it.
Yeah.
But, reading reading things isn't really the best way to solve a problem. So I read a lot about it.
Yeah.
And spoke to my friends a lot about it, but I didn't do much else about it.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
No, I just worked and smiled, and all my friends thought I loved practicing law and said, you seem like the happiest person practicing family law. And I would just say, there's good days and bad days. Yeah. But if you asked me if I would do it any differently.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you that.
Yeah.
So, what would you do differently?
I don't think I could do anything differently. I mean, I can say I would be more objective, but you can't just say that to yourself and do it.
Yeah.
Or I wouldn't take this so personally, but you can't just say that and do it. So the question is, would I have gone for some assistance? And I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And by the way, I didn't mean to put you on the spot by asking you about
okay.
LAP, because I already knew that you hadn't, and so I didn't want to,
Yeah, but I wouldn't have gone there, but I would have phoned up Derek and said, Derek, come talk to me.
Yeah, excellent.
But
Fantastic.
And I too had access to everybody that I needed to talk to about anything.
Yeah.
So, there were psychologists that I knew that did family law things, and I would go talk to them about this kind of stuff, just off the cuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I had readily available resources if I needed it.
Yeah. And
whereas
that's
a lot
fantastic.
of people don't.
And that was your network.
Yeah.
That was really, really good.
Yeah.
And you also have, what was your path to law? Like, do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because you weren't always sure that you wanted to do law.
No.
And I think that's a really interesting story,
yeah.
because sometimes it's not that clear what that path is.
Yeah. I always thought I wanted to be a lawyer. And so I went to law school, and I was accepted at the top law schools in Ontario, in Osgoode Hall and U of T. I think I told you that I was at Osgoode Hall, but I drove to U of T every night because it was more fun there. And the cold wind started blowing in Ontario into Osgoode Hall in November, and I missed my friends. I missed Vancouver, and I just said, I'm coming home. So I came home, and I did a master's degree in counseling psychology. That's the kind, compassionate part of me that nobody's supposed to see. And as I told you, my psychology professor told me that I had to go back to law school or I would never feel fulfilled.
Yeah.
So that was the path. And I knew I wanted to do family law for some reason. In law school, I was one of the only few who knew what I wanted to do, which was good because when I started practicing, everybody sent all the family law stuff to me because nobody wanted to touch it with a 10-foot pole.
Yeah.
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 And so, you often ask this to your guests, what advice would you give to young lawyers who are experiencing some of the, the doubts about
Well, I can tell you, I can tell you that when I left my last law firm a number of years ago, I wanted to speak to all the young lawyers there about what I had gone through. And they were amazed, because I would tell them the story I just told you. You felt that way? It's amazing. I never thought in the world you felt that way. And then I just knew that it was okay for them to feel that way sometimes. So unfortunately, telling the story is one of the best things you can do, so young lawyers can identify with it and say, I've suffered from that too, or I feel that way too. I mean, everybody was amazed that I worried so much about stuff.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of lawyers do experience, sometimes vicarious trauma through all the things that they hear from their clients. And I think you said that you sometimes had sleepless nights.
Oh, yes.
And so what would what's your advice to lawyers who are experiencing that?
Well, all you can do is talk to people. That's all. And all you can do is talk to your colleagues about it and your friends about it. And they're all going to say, I go through that sometimes too. So you know that you're not alone.
Yeah. I think that's really good advice. And call LAP if you don't want to talk to your friends about it.
Yeah, call LAP.
And it's all confidential, and so they can do that as well.
Yeah, call Lawyers Assistance Program, which I never did, because I told you this, Shelina, on our call before, because I didn't want anybody to know I had any weaknesses as a lawyer.
Yeah.
Not personally, but as a lawyer, I never wanted anybody to know that I suffered anything except being a tough person when practicing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's hard to show that vulnerability sometimes, but when you do, all these other lawyers that you spoke to are going to know it's okay, it's normal, and there's help available, and there's options. And I actually did take a course when I was at Legal Aid, at the Legal Aid Clinic. I took the What to Do with Your Law degree. And there's two things that really stand out, and this was many, many years ago, because I was doing legal aid family law, and it was really tough. You were dealing with mental health, addictions, poverty, not to mention the family law stuff. So it was really difficult work. And I remember, sorting out these cards about what you definitely don't want to do in your next position and what you do want to do and what you're maybe about, and that experience of sorting out these cards. And it was really helpful sometimes to be able to sort of look at what your transferable skills are and what you may want to do in your next position to kind of move you forward. And the other thing was they had a panel of lawyers that had left law and done something completely different. And that was really inspiring. And I think that made me realize that there's lots of options, that you can take your law degree, and it's valuable in and of itself, and do lots of different things with it. So I think, some of that now is available online, but I think you're right, like reading and learning about sort of what's happening and then trying to look at some of those things.
I should also say that I had the best colleagues imaginable. And that was the best part of my whole career, if somebody asked me. I just had great colleagues. I didn't talk to them much about what we're talking about now, and I probably should have, but I didn't.
Yeah.
But I had great colleagues and great connections in that way. Yeah. So
now you did a lot of volunteer work too. I mean, and that was something that I did as well, to make things interesting, sort of the pro bono, low bono kinds of things as an add-on. Yeah. And you're continuing to do volunteer work.
Oh, I thought I was getting paid for this.
Which, is sort of giving back, to the community, and also getting some satisfaction and fulfillment from that as well. Yeah. And so and I don't know if I can, ask you this, and so how do you see yourself moving forward? Like, you're doing this, and, what sorts of things are you looking forward to doing moving forward?
That's a great question. I don't know if it's looking forward or fear. because I don't know what I would do if I didn't have to do this, or I wasn't working as an ethics advisor at the Law Society. So it's the fear. That's more fear than looking forward.
Yeah,
I would say.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And that's really interesting because,
Yeah.
and also you're not alone, because being a lawyer is a big part of your identity, and so there are there's a whole thing about, instead of retirement, refirement or rewirement, or how you're going to look at that next phase in terms of what you want to do, and finding passion and joy and designing that for yourself. So I think you'll probably have many more adventures.
Well, one thing I don't know how to do is make wooden canoes or stuff like that. I don't have any projects like that, which I should have. Anyway, Shelina, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
For sure, I'm not going to ask anybody else to ask me questions. I'm not used to that. Yeah. I don't know why I gave you license to do that. So you can bring out in people that kind of thing, which is probably the answer to a lot of questions that I asked you today. Is you can bring out people's vulnerabilities, fears, and concerns. Well, just talking to you. Yeah. So I'm going to go into the next little phase of the show, but it seems to be real at odds with what we were talking about. So in 2 weeks, it's going to be the beer show. The owner of Steamworks, who practiced law before he became very successful in the brewery and hospitality industry, will be my guest. And I can tell you that Steamworks Pilsner is just an excellent beer. So I hope everybody watches the show in 2 weeks. And thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.